The Pacific swells rise like cathedral walls around HMS Centurion. It is the 20th of June, 1743, off the Philippine coast near Cape Espiritu Santo. Commodore George Anson stands on his quarterdeck, studying the horizon through his glass. There, a sail. Not just any vessel, but the treasure ship he has crossed an ocean to find. The Nuestra Señora de Covadonga, the Manila galleon, laden with over 1 million pieces of eight and bound for the Philippines from Acapulco. Anson has perhaps 200 men fit for duty. The Spanish galleon carries 550 souls. His ship is battle-worn, patched with makeshift repairs from 3 years at sea. The enemy vessel bristles with armament designed to repel pirates and privateers. Yet Anson signals for general quarters without hesitation. The deck drums beat. Men stream to their stations, survivors of a voyage that has already claimed 1,600 of their shipmates. They are the ghosts of a shattered squadron, the remnants of 8 ships reduced to 1. The distance closes. Flags snap in the tropical wind. Spanish colors rise on the galleon. British ensigns answer from Centurion. In the next 90 minutes, everything Anson has endured, the storms that nearly destroyed his fleet off Cape Horn, the scurvy that turned his men's flesh black and their teeth to splinters, the 3-year odyssey around the globe will be justified or rendered futile. This is the moment upon which an entire expedition balances. Yet, pull back from this scene, step away from the smoke and thunder soon to come, and a curious fact emerges. George Anson's voyage ranks amongst the most catastrophic disasters in Royal Navy history. Of nearly 2,000 men who departed England, fewer than 500 would see home again. Entire ships vanished, crews mutinied. The Spanish knew he was coming before he arrived. By any reasonable measure, the expedition should have been abandoned as a failure months before this encounter. Instead, it became a triumph that would reshape British naval power for a generation. We remember Nelson's victory, Drake's circumnavigation, Cook's discoveries. We forget Anson's Centurion. Yet no single voyage did more to establish the professional foundations of the Royal Navy in the 18th century. The lessons Anson learned in those terrible years about leadership, logistics, and the brutal calculus of survival would inform his subsequent reforms as First Lord of the Admiralty during the 7 Years' War. The treasure he captured would make him one of Britain's wealthiest men. The reputation he forged would elevate him to the peerage and the highest ranks of the service. This is the story of how catastrophe became legend, of how a 43-year-old Commodore with a talent for quiet competence took a dying squadron across the Pacific and returned with enough Spanish silver to fill 32 wagons, of how the worst voyage in naval memory became the foundation for Britain's maritime supremacy. This is the voyage of George Anson, the forgotten father of the modern Royal Navy. George Anson entered the world on the 23rd of April, 1697, at Shugborough Manor in Staffordshire. He was born into genteel obscurity. The Ansons were landed gentry of modest means, respectable but not prominent. His father, William, served as a country squire. His mother, Isabella Carrier, brought a useful connection. Her brother-in-law was Thomas Parker, Earl of Macclesfield, who would serve as Lord Chancellor until his impeachment for fraud in 1725. This familial patronage proved decisive. In February of 1712, aged 14, young Anson joined the Royal Navy as a volunteer aboard HMS Ruby. The War of Spanish Succession still raged across Europe. Boys of his class entered the service early, learning seamanship and navigation through practical immersion rather than formal education. Anson transferred quickly to HMS Monmouth, serving through the war's final campaigns. Promoted to lieutenant in March of 1716, he was assigned to HMS Hampshire in Admiral John Norris's Baltic Fleet routine duty protecting British merchant interests. His early career reveals a pattern. steady advancement through competence rather than brilliance, careful cultivation of useful connections, and an apparent talent for tasks requiring patience and methodical execution. In March of 1718, serving aboard HMS Montague, he saw his first serious action at the Battle of Cape Passaro, where Admiral George Byng destroyed a Spanish fleet off Sicily during the War of the Quadruple Alliance. The battle demonstrated to young Anson the devastating effectiveness of well-handled ships of the line operating in coordination. It was a lesson he would not forget. Promotion to commander came in June of 1722. His first command was the 8-gun sloop HMS Weasel, with orders to suppress smuggling between Britain and Holland. Anson executed the task with such efficiency that within months he was promoted to post captain and given command of the 32-gun HMS Scarborough. His new assignment: escort British merchant convoys operating from the Carolinas. He would spend the next decade in this posting and subsequent commands: HMS Garland, HMS Diamond, HMS Squirrel, protecting trade along the American seaboard. The district of Ansonboro in Charleston, South Carolina, still commemorates his time there. These were not glamorous years. No fleet actions, no diplomatic triumphs, simply the grinding work of convoy protection, anti-piracy patrol, and the delicate politics of maintaining British authority in distant waters. Yet they provided Anson with invaluable experience in independent command far from the Admiralty's oversight. He learned to maintain discipline with limited resources, to navigate unfamiliar waters without accurate charts, to manage provisions across long deployments. Most critically, he learned patience, the ability to endure monotony, to maintain readiness through endless weeks of routine, to husband resources against future need. In 1737, now 40 years old, Anson received command of HMS Centurion, a 60-gun third-rate ship of the line, and orders to patrol West African waters before deploying to the Caribbean. The Centurion was not a new vessel, but she was solid, well-found, and capable. Anson spent the next 3 years in her, developing an intimate knowledge of the ship's capabilities and limitations. When word reached London in 1739 that war with Spain had been declared the so-called War of Jenkins's Ear, sparked by escalating commercial disputes and imperial rivalries, Anson and Centurion were already positioned for more aggressive operations. The Duke of Newcastle, serving as Secretary of State, conceived an ambitious plan. Whilst Admiral Edward Vernon attacked Spanish settlements in the Caribbean, a separate squadron would be dispatched around Cape Horn to raid Spanish possessions along the Pacific coast of South America. The objectives were threefold: disrupt Spanish silver shipments from Peru, capture one of the fabulously wealthy Manila galleons that crossed the Pacific annually, and potentially establish a British presence in the region. The strategic logic was sound. The Pacific coast of Spanish America remained lightly defended, the distances too vast for rapid reinforcement from Europe. A determined raiding force might accomplish disproportionate damage. In June of 1740, Anson was promoted to Commodore and given command of the expedition. On paper, the force appeared formidable. His flagship, Centurion, the 50-gun ships Gloucester, Severn, and Pearl, the 40-gun Wager, the 20-gun sloop Trial, and 2 supply vessels, Anna and Industry. Nearly 2,000 men would sail. 500 Marines would provide landing forces for coastal raids. The reality proved far grimmer. Higher priority requirements for Vernon's Caribbean operations siphoned away the promised Marines. In their place, the Admiralty assigned 500 pensioners from the Royal Hospital at Chelsea Old Soldiers, many veterans of Marlborough's continental campaigns decades earlier, now in their 60s or 70s, most unfit for arduous service. To these were added 210 raw recruits from a newly raised Marine regiment, untrained and undisciplined. The ship's crews consisted largely of pressed men, landsmen with no seafaring experience, and wharf sweepers swept up by press gangs. It was, in the words of one officer, a squadron manned by invalids and commanded to perform a service demanding men of the greatest strength and agility. Anson protested. The Admiralty demurred, but offered no alternatives. Departure was delayed repeatedly by unfavorable winds and bureaucratic incompetence. French intelligence agents in English ports noted the preparations and passed word to Madrid. Spain dispatched 5 warships under Admiral José Pizarro to intercept the British squadron, either at Madeira or in South American waters. Finally, on the 18th of September, 40 weeks behind schedule, Anson's squadron cleared Spithead. The delays would prove catastrophic. By departing late, Anson would be forced to round Cape Horn in the worst possible season, facing the full fury of the Southern Ocean's winter storms. The Commodore maintained careful discipline as the squadron sailed south. At Madeira, Portuguese officials warned that Spanish warships had been seen nearby. Anson dispatched scouts but found nothing. The Spanish fleet had already departed, racing ahead to position themselves for ambush. At St. Catherine's Island off the Brazilian coast in December, the squadron paused to take on water and provisions. Disease was already spreading through the overcrowded ships. The elderly pensioners were dying at an alarming rate, their constitutions unable to withstand the rigors of sea service. Anson set strict rendezvous points in case of separation: Port St. Julian, then the island of Nuestra Señora del Socorro, then Juan Fernandez. His orders to subordinate captains were explicit. Even if Centurion were lost, the expedition should continue. The strategic objective remained paramount. On the 7th of March, 1741, the squadron reached the entrance to the Strait of Le Maire at the tip of South America. Weather appeared favorable. Anson ordered the passage to begin. Within hours, conditions deteriorated. A violent gale from the south drove the ships toward the rocky coasts of Staten Island. For the next 8 weeks, the squadron would endure some of the most punishing weather ever recorded in naval annals. Cape Horn has broken stronger fleets than Anson's. The convergence of Atlantic and Pacific creates conditions of singular ferocity. Enormous swells driven by unobstructed westerly winds. Frequent storms of shocking violence. Temperatures barely above freezing, even in summer. In late autumn, which Anson faced due to the delayed departure, conditions become nearly unsurvivable. The squadron scattered almost immediately. Mountainous seas separated the ships. Communication became impossible. Each vessel fought independently for survival, battered by winds that tore away sails and rigging, drenched by icy waves that swept across decks, driven eastward by gales when they desperately needed to progress west. Ships would claw westward for days, only to be blown back to their starting position in a single night of storm. The sloop Trial was assigned to lead, watching for ice. Carrying sufficient sail to stay ahead of the larger vessels left her dangerously unstable, with men on deck continuously exposed to freezing water. The deck guns, constantly soaked, could not be fired even if ice were spotted. After several days of this, Captain Cheap replaced Trial with Pearl in the vanguard position. Captain Saumarez of Pearl would later write, "Really, life is not worth pursuing at the expense of such hardships." As the physical ordeal mounted, disease struck with devastating force. Scurvy had been known to mariners for centuries, a disease that caused gums to swell and bleed, teeth to loosen and fall out, old wounds to reopen, limbs to blacken with subcutaneous bleeding. Victims became listless, then delirious, then died. No effective prevention existed. Sailors subsisted on salt meat, ship's biscuit, and whatever fresh provisions could be loaded at port. Once those ran out, scurvy was inevitable on extended voyages. Combined with typhus from lice-infested quarters and dysentery from contaminated water, the disease turned Anson's ships into floating charnel houses. Men died by the dozens. On HMS Centurion alone, 43 men died in April. By May, the toll reached 66. On some mornings, 6 or 8 bodies would be sewn into canvas and consigned to the depths. The survivors, weakened and terrified, struggled to manage ships that required hundreds of fit men to handle safely. HMS Severn and HMS Pearl fought the storms for weeks before their captains concluded the passage was impossible. Both ships turned back, eventually making port in Brazil. The crews had suffered grievously, but at least they survived. HMS Wager proved less fortunate. The Wager, originally an East Indiaman purchased by the Navy, was never suited for naval service in these waters. Her captain, David Cheap, had been third in command when the voyage began but had spent much of the journey ill in his cabin. After the narrow escape from Cape Noir, Wager lost sight of the other vessels. Cheap ordered a course toward Socorro Island, the designated first rendezvous, despite warnings from Lieutenant Robert Baines and the ship's gunner John Bulkley that approaching the coast in a damaged vessel with only 12 men fit for duty was suicidal. On the 13th of May, 1741, the carpenter reported sighting land to the west. The observation seemed impossible. The mainland lay to the east, but without accurate charts. The report was dismissed. Hours later, Wager struck rocks off the Chilean coast. The ship broke apart. Crew members reached shore with whatever supplies they could salvage. Over the following months, discipline collapsed entirely. Cheap shot and killed midshipman Henry Cozens during a confrontation, then refused the wounded man medical care. Cozens died 10 days later. The survivors built a crude schooner from Wager's remains. On the 13th of October, Gunner Bulkley officially declared mutiny, arrested Cheap for murder, and departed with most of the crew in the makeshift vessel. Cheap and a handful of loyal men were abandoned on the desolate island. Through remarkable fortune, both groups eventually reached civilization, Bulkley's party making Brazil, Cheap's group captured by Spanish authorities and eventually repatriated. The Wager mutiny would become one of the most notorious incidents in naval history, inspiring multiple accounts and, much later, a best-selling book. For Anson, ignorant of Wager's fate, the immediate challenge was survival. HMS Centurion finally rounded the Horn and turned north in mid-April, but accurate navigation remained impossible. Pre-chronometer navigation depended on latitude calculations, relatively straightforward using solar observations, but could not reliably determine longitude. Charts of the region were primitive and often wildly inaccurate. Anson believed he was searching in the correct area for Juan Fernandez Island when, in fact, he was 300 nautical miles west of his actual position. The error cost 70 lives in 9 days whilst Centurion searched waters that contained no island. By the time Anson recognized the mistake and corrected course, his crew was dying at horrific rates. When Centurion finally anchored at Juan Fernandez on the 8th of May, 1741, only a handful of men remained fit enough to work the ship. Bodies had to be lowered over the side, because too few living sailors possessed the strength to carry them. The island proved salvation. Juan Fernandez was uninhabited. It had once sheltered Alexander Selkirk, whose marooning would inspire Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe and offered abundant fresh water, wild greens, turnips, radishes, and edible vegetation high in what we now know as vitamin C. Fish teemed in the surrounding waters. Anson immediately ordered the sick landed to tents erected on shore. Recovery proved agonizingly slow. Men continued dying for nearly 3 weeks after landing. The final death toll would not be calculated for months. On the 21st of June, a sail appeared. HMS Gloucester limped into the anchorage, barely able to maneuver. Since leaving Port Street, Julian, 254 men had died. Only 92 survived, most debilitated by scurvy. 6 days passed before Gloucester could be warped into Cumberland Bay. On the 16th of August, Anna arrived, miraculously intact. The small sloop Trial had arrived weeks earlier. By September, most survivors had recovered sufficiently to undertake repairs. Anson faced a strategic decision. His force had been catastrophically reduced. Of 961 men who had sailed from England aboard Centurion, Gloucester, and Trial, only 335 remained alive. 2 capital ships, 2 frigates, and a store ship were either lost or forced back. Communications with England had ceased 9 months earlier. The strategic situation might have changed entirely. Spain might even have sued for peace. Yet Anson's orders had been explicit: prosecute the mission. The Pacific coast of Spanish America remained lightly defended. Operating with limited resources represented Anson's strength, honed through decades of independent command. He decided to proceed. The depleted squadron departed Juan Fernandez in September 1741 and began raiding operations along the South American coast. Intelligence gathered from captured Spanish merchantmen revealed that Admiral Pizarro's squadron had suffered as badly as Anson's force rounding Cape Horn and had returned to Spain. The Pacific lay open. Over the following months, Anson captured multiple Spanish merchant vessels, gathering prize money and fresh intelligence. On the 14th of November, his force attacked and sacked the port town of Paita in Peru. The raid demonstrated Anson's tactical competence. He landed assault parties before dawn, overwhelmed the minimal defenses, seized substantial quantities of treasure and supplies, then withdrew before Spanish forces could respond. Contemporary accounts emphasized his scrupulous treatment of prisoners, a courtesy that Spanish authorities would later reciprocate when dealing with wager survivors. By January of 1742, Anson had sailed north to the waters off Acapulco, hoping to intercept the Manila galleon on its annual westward crossing to the Philippines. Intelligence indicated the treasure ship had already departed 3 weeks earlier. Worse, Spanish authorities had been warned of Anson's presence and had delayed subsequent departures indefinitely. With provisions running low and crews again falling victim to scurvy, Anson faced another decision: abandon the mission or cross the Pacific to intercept the galleon on its return voyage to Acapulco. He chose the latter. In March of 1742, the squadron, now reduced to Centurion, Gloucester, and Trial, set course westward across the Pacific. The passage was nightmarish. Contrary winds and dead calms extended the crossing to months instead of weeks. Scurvy returned with vengeance. Men died daily. Anson resorted to recruiting enslaved Africans from captured Spanish vessels simply to have enough hands to work the ships. By the time the squadron reached Tinian Island near Guam in August, Gloucester was finished. The ship was barely seaworthy, riddled with rot, and could not be adequately repaired with available resources. Anson ordered her stripped, her surviving crew transferred to Centurion, and the hulk scuttled. The tiny Trial had already been destroyed as unseaworthy. HMS Centurion now sailed alone, one ship, 201 men, thousands of miles from home. After recuperating at Tinian and taking on supplies at Macau, where Chinese authorities proved obstructive and suspicious, Centurion departed in April of 1743 to hunt the Manila galleon. Anson positioned his ship along the galleon's expected route between the Philippines and Acapulco. On the 20th of June, lookouts spotted a sail. The Nuestra Señora de Covadonga was newer, larger, and more heavily manned than HMS Centurion. Under normal circumstances, she would have been formidable, but her commander, Geronimo Montero, had made a fatal error. To make room for additional passengers and silver cargo, he had removed most of the ship's cannons, leaving only 13 of 50 guns mounted. The galleon was a treasure ship pretending to be a warship. Anson recognized the weakness immediately. He had spent months drilling his depleted crew, ensuring that every man could perform multiple roles, that gun crews could maintain steady fire despite inferior numbers. When Centurion closed to engagement range, Anson positioned his ship to rake the galleon's stern, a classic maneuver that allowed his broadside to sweep the enemy's length, whilst the galleon's few remaining guns could not effectively reply. The battle lasted 90 minutes. Spanish resistance was fierce but ultimately futile. Outgunned and outmaneuvered, with casualties mounting, Montero struck his colors. British losses: 2 men killed, 17 wounded. Spanish casualties: 58 dead, 84 wounded. Anson's prize contained 1,313,843 pieces of 35,682 ounces of virgin silver and additional valuables. The total value exceeded £400,000, roughly £60 million in modern currency. Anson took the Covadonga back to Macau, sold her cargo to Chinese merchants, and kept the specie. In November of 1743, Centurion sailed for England via the Cape of Good Hope, carrying enough treasure to require additional reinforcements to the ship's structure. Anson navigated carefully through waters where French squadrons operated, seeking to intercept him. On the 15th of June, 1744, he slipped through fog past a French fleet patrolling the channel and anchored at Spithead. Of the nearly 2,000 men who had sailed, 188 remained. The squadron of 8 vessels had been reduced to 1. Yet Anson had circumnavigated the globe, captured treasure worth a king's ransom, and accomplished his strategic objectives despite losses that would have justified abandoning the mission a dozen times over. London erupted in celebration. The treasure was paraded through the streets in 32 wagons, crowds cheering as the procession moved from the Tower to the Admiralty. Anson received a substantial share as prize money, enough to make him one of Britain's wealthiest men. He was elevated to Rear Admiral, then Vice Admiral, then Baron. In April of 1748, he married Lady Elizabeth York, daughter of the Lord Chancellor. But Anson's greatest contribution lay not in treasure captured but in lessons learned. As First Lord of the Admiralty from 1751 to 1756, and again from 1757 until his death, he instituted sweeping reforms that transformed the Royal Navy into the most professional fighting service in the world. He removed corrupt defense contractors who had supplied his expedition with rotten provisions and unseaworthy vessels. He improved medical care, establishing systems for supplying fresh provisions to fleets at sea, direct response to the scurvy that had decimated his crews. He submitted revised articles of war to Parliament, tightening discipline throughout the service. He introduced uniforms for commissioned officers, creating professional identity and esprit de corps. He transferred the Marines from Army to Navy authority, ensuring amphibious forces trained specifically for naval operations. He established a system for rating ships according to their armament, bringing order to fleet organization. Most critically, he oversaw the Navy's strategic posture during the 7 Years' War. He established a permanent Western squadron at Devonport to patrol approaches to both Britain and France. When French invasion threatened in 1759, Anson instituted a close blockade of the French coast that proved crippling to France's economy and eliminated any realistic invasion threat. The victories at Lagos and Quiberon Bay that year owed much to the infrastructure and strategic planning Anson had established. William Pitt later stated, "To his wisdom, to his experience, the nation owes the glorious success of the last war." Modern historians concur. The 7 Years' War saw Britain emerge as the dominant global maritime power, acquiring Canada, India, and Caribbean territories that would define the empire for generations. That supremacy rested on foundations Anson built. Yet recognition came with qualification. Anson was elevated to Admiral of the Fleet in 1761, but contemporaries noted his personal reserve and political awkwardness. Horace Walpole quipped that Anson had been round the world, but never in it, a pointed reference to his lack of social graces and court connections. He was respected, even admired, but rarely loved. On the 6th of June, 1762, whilst escorting the new Queen Charlotte's brother on a tour of Portsmouth, Anson caught a cold that developed into pneumonia. He died at Moor Park in Hertfordshire, the country estate he had purchased with Spanish prize money, and was buried at St. Michael and All Angels Church in Colwich, Staffordshire, not far from where his journey had begun 65 years earlier. Stand today at Portsmouth's historic dockyard, and no grand monument celebrates George Anson's achievements. Walk through the National Maritime Museum, and his portrait hangs with dozens of other forgotten admirals. Search contemporary consciousness for his name, and most draw blanks. Nelson eclipses him. Drake overshadows him. Even lesser-known figures like Hawke command greater recognition. Yet modern naval officers study Anson's voyage as a masterclass in crisis leadership. The United States Naval Institute published analysis as recently as 2023, examining how Anson maintained mission focus despite catastrophic losses, maintained crew discipline through unimaginable hardship, and adapted tactics to compensate for numerical and material disadvantages. His ability to make sound strategic decisions with fragmentary intelligence, to husband resources across multi-year deployments, to maintain offensive operations despite defensive preoccupations, these lessons remain intensely relevant. The voyage's published account, edited from Anson's papers and Chaplain Richard Walter's journals by mathematician Benjamin Robbins, became a sensation. Published in 1748, A Voyage Round the World went through over 100 editions in multiple languages across 2 centuries. It influenced a generation of British naval officers and informed public understanding of Pacific geography. Charles Darwin read it aboard HMS Beagle. James Cook consulted it before his own Pacific explorations. The book made Anson's journey culturally significant in ways the man himself never achieved. Modern scholarship has reassessed several aspects. The voyage revealed the Royal Navy's institutional failings: inadequate provisioning, corrupt contractors, dysfunctional medical care, primitive navigation. That over 80% of the expedition's personnel died represents not merely bad luck but systemic failure. Anson's subsequent reforms addressed these exact deficiencies, suggesting he recognized them clearly. The imperial context cannot be ignored. Anson sailed to raid Spanish colonies, capture treasure ships, and extend British power into territories Spain claimed. His tactical brilliance and personal courage existed within a framework of European imperial competition that treated distant populations as pawns and indigenous peoples as obstacles. The silver he captured had been mined by forced indigenous labor under conditions of shocking brutality. Celebrating the naval achievement whilst ignoring this context presents incomplete history. Yet complexity enriches rather than diminishes the story. Anson exemplified a particular type of British military excellence, not flashy charisma but methodical competence, not reckless courage but calculated risk-taking, not innovative genius but patient professionalism. He took catastrophically flawed resources and achieved strategic objectives through sheer determination and practical skill. When every reason existed to abandon the mission, he persisted. When survival seemed impossible, he adapted. The treasure wagons rolling through London streets in 1744 carried more than Spanish silver. They carried a message. Britain could project power globally, could maintain operations across years and oceans, could overcome defeats that would break lesser nations. That message informed British strategy for the next century and a half. 8 ships of the Royal Navy have borne Anson's name. Places from North Carolina to Maine commemorate him. The Anson family seat at Shugborough Hall displays portraits and relics from the voyage. Yet these tributes feel perfunctory, obligatory rather than genuine. We commemorate Anson dutifully but do not celebrate him passionately. Perhaps that is appropriate. Anson was never a romantic figure. He did not court fame or cultivate legend. He simply executed his duty with extraordinary competence under impossible circumstances. When an alternative was failure, he succeeded. When easier options beckoned, he persisted. When glory came, he accepted it quietly and used the resulting influence to fix the systems that had nearly killed him. That is the essence of his contribution, transforming personal ordeal into institutional improvement, turning private suffering into public benefit. The 1,600 men who died during his voyage did not perish in vain if their deaths prompted reforms that saved thousands subsequently. Anson ensured those deaths mattered. So remember the wagons of treasure, certainly. But remember more importantly the reforms, the fresh provisions, the professional medical corps, the uniform standards of discipline, the strategic doctrines. Remember that Britain's century of naval supremacy was built by men like Anson, not brilliant, not charismatic, but grimly, relentlessly competent. In an age that celebrates flash over substance, Anson reminds us of substance's power. He took a dying squadron around the world and returned with enough treasure to alter history. More impressively, he learned enough from the nightmare to prevent its repetition. That is his legacy. That is why forgotten heroes matter. That is why we must remember George Anson not because he was famous, but because he made the famous victories possible.